When it comes to the history of the Provisional IRA, there are many divisive figures within the paramilitary group. Some were beloved who then fell out of favour, either by leaning too far towards peace or refusing to give up the violence. Both for the same reason, for feeling like their aims have not yet been met. But few are as beloved as Brendan Hughes, and he has been one of the most requested individuals to feature on this podcast to date. His story is quite unique, because in the years before he died, Hughes was extremely candid about his time in the Provisional IRA. He contributed to the Boston College Tapes project between 2001 and 2006, providing an insight into his time in the IRA, which was revealed to the world after his death in 2008. And what he said had significant repercussions for people still alive today, and especially Gerry Adams. Through these interviews, we've been given an extremely rare insight into his life behind the veil of being a paramilitary. This is the story of the Troubles, told entirely from the perspective of the dark Brendan Hughes. This is the Troubles podcast, a podcast about the violence and bloodshed that occurred in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland and Great Britain, as multiple sides and organisations waged a bloody conflict over the status of Northern Ireland. Just a heads up that the vast majority of this account is from Brendan Hughes' perspective, as recorded and published in the book Voices from the Grave by journalist Ed Maloney. Brendan Hughes was born in June 1948. He was raised on the Lower Falls Road in Belfast, which is a predominantly nationalist area, but the part that he was raised in was a bit different. Blackwater Street on the Grosvenor Road was actually a predominantly Protestant area. His grandparents had been relatively well off and had purchased the family home that Brendan and his siblings grew up in. As a result of this, most of the friendships he had as a child were with Protestant youths, but many on the street disliked him and his family because they were Catholics. Brendan recalled an old lady who used to spit at him whenever he passed by her home. His mother died when she was 31, leaving his father raising 6 children alone. His father worked carrying tiles on his head, making £11 a week, and doing his best to keep the family together. It was suggested after the death of his wife to send some of the children off to relatives to live, but he refused. Times were extremely tight. Hughes recalls one time when there was no money to buy any food, not even for a loaf of bread. The family had an outside toilet and a lead pipe connected the cistern to the toilet. Brendan's father got a hacksaw and cut through the pipe, then sent Brendan to bring the lead pipe to the scrapyard for some money. With the money, they could afford chips, a loaf of bread and margarine. His father and mother, as well as one set of grandparents, were both Republicans. His father had been interned in the 1940s, but he eased off on his Republican activity once his wife had died, so as to raise the children. Hughes described his father's type of republicanism as more of a working-class socialism, and he spent much of his youth hearing about his grandmother telling stories about IRA activities in the 20s and 30s. To Brendan, the IRA was made up of friends and family, who had a deep mistrust of security services and orange extremists. His father often got into arguments with neighbours around July 12th, which is a Protestant celebration. An orange arch would be erected on their street and was always erected outside the Hughes house, which was the only Catholic house on the street. In one instance, his father ripped down the arch and the family had to briefly leave their home. As a teenager and the sole Catholic on the street, Hughes was often singled out. He would get fined for not having lights on his bicycle, or for playing football on the street, or playing cards. In one instance, when he was 13 or 14, he was caught playing cards and brought to a station to be interviewed. He ended up naming the others who had been playing cards with him. He was then brought home, where he told his father what he had done, and he was hit by his father for naming the others who had been playing cards with him. For the likes of Hughes, the idea of a secondary school wasn't really a possibility. He called his time in primary school as training you for the building sites or for manual labour jobs. Getting out of the Falls Road was not easy, but there was one route: the Merchant Navy. This was a common way to get out of Northern Ireland and see a bit of the world, much like Alan Black in one of my previous episodes. Hughes signed up when he was 16, which saw him travelling over to England to complete his training. Then, travelling with the Merchant Navy, he got to see the Persian Gulf and South Africa. These trips were quite eye-opening for Hughes, and the disparity in South Africa really affected him. In his own words, "I just didn't become a rebel in 1970. I didn't become a gunman in 1970. I didn't become a revolutionary in 1970. That process was built up over the years, and years of seeing privation, years of seeing exploitation, years of seeing hunger and sadness and love." The riots of August 1969 are generally seen as the beginning of the conflict known as the Troubles in Northern Ireland. First, there was the Battle of the Bogside, which was 3 days of rioting in Derry between nationalist residents and the police force, the RUC and Loyalists. This started on August 12th and continued for 3 days. Then, as part of that rioting, we saw the burning of Bombay Street, which was a street smack bang in the middle of the Catholic Falls Road and the Protestant Shankill Road in Belfast. On August 15th, a mob of Loyalists descended down Bombay, demanding to burn the Redemptionist monastery there. There was a belief that Republican gunmen used the spires to shoot down on the people on the Shankill Road. In reality, by this stage, there were very few guns in the hands of Republicans, save for a couple of rifles, a couple of revolvers, and one Thompson or Tommy gun, which would have been quite old by this stage. Hughes remembers that his old school, St. Comgall's School, was being attacked by Loyalists with petrol bombs, and he ended up guiding an IRA member who was in possession of the Tommy gun through the halls of his old school and up onto the roof. Hughes wanted him to shoot into the crowd of Loyalists attacking the school, but the man was instructed not to by a senior member of the IRA. Instead, he shot into the air and dispersed the crowd. Maloney writes, in Voices from the Grave, that these were the first authorised shots fired by the IRA during the Troubles. But as you can imagine, this is a hard fact to verify. Hughes was conflicted. His street had been wrecked by Loyalists and he wanted revenge. He gathered a group and started making his way toward a Protestant street in the hope of burning the people out of their homes. But they were prevented by the official IRA, who didn't want to encourage this type of retaliatory violence. In the end, Bombay Street couldn't be saved, and 60 homes of Catholics were torched by the Loyalist mob. As a result of the rioting, around 1,500 Catholics were displaced. For Hughes, any of the Protestant families remained on his mixed street quietly fled their homes within the next few days. The burning of Bombay Street was an important moment in the foundation of the Provisional IRA. It was the beginning of a settling of the lines, which would set the scene for the Troubles. When Loyalists came to attack the Catholic areas, there was no one there to protect the Catholics. They had been let down by the IRA. The Provisional IRA wouldn't let this happen again, and it was only a few months later that the IRA would split into the officials and the provisionals. This wasn't really a surprise split, and the provisionals had been slowly organising in the lead-up, and Brendan Hughes had been talent spotted quite early on. He had a reputation for being a hard nut. Though he was from a Republican background, Hughes believed that those who joined the provisionals in the early days did so because of what had occurred during the August rioting, not necessarily because of political ideology. The older Republicans saw it as a new war with England, but for Hughes and other young men, they were protecting their communities. He was approached by John Joe McGee and then was recruited by his cousin Charlie Hughes, who was already a member. Brendan and 12 others were brought to a house where they sat down with Joe Cahill, who tried to scare them off becoming a paramilitary. Here's Brendan speaking in Peter Taylor's 1997 documentary, Provos.
I made the initial contact and I was taken away by older men and given a long talking to. We were told that to expect death, jail, and if we were lucky, we would come out of it with our lives.
After a number of these sessions, of the 12, only 5 remained, one of which was Hughes. He was sworn in and became a volunteer in D Company, 2nd Battalion of the Belfast Brigade of the Provisional IRA. D Company covered 3 main areas, the Lower Falls, Clonard and Divis Flats. In D Company, who went on to become known as the Dogs, Hughes learned how to use the old, rusty World War II guns that they had at their disposal, and soon became their training officer. Most of these training camps took place in the Republic of Ireland. The men would make their way down to Dublin, then at night they would be brought to a farm somewhere in Ireland and get a chance to use the weapons. They were trained on revolvers, semi-automatics, rifles and explosives. Back on the Lower Falls Road, barricades had been erected to prevent the British forces from coming in. D Company had their headquarters at an old paint factory near there. They occasionally carried out an armed patrol of the Falls Road to show people that they were actively protecting the area. In the early days, he would still socialise and drink with British soldiers, believing that the fight was against the RUC and B Specials, and D Company carried out a number of attacks on RUC barracks around Belfast. They initially didn't target the British Army, but this soon changed. On July 3rd, 1970, we saw the Falls Curfew, where British troops sealed off the Lower Falls area in Belfast for a weapons search, sparking riots and gun battles with the IRA. Over a period of 34 hours, soldiers fired over 1,600 CS gas canisters, searched around 1,000 homes, and 4 civilians were killed. There were around 60 to 90 officials involved, and only around 11 provisionals, one of which was Brendan. The provisionals had offered to help the officials, but this offer was rejected, showing early signs of the division between the two groups. The sentiment against the British Army had also been changing throughout 1970, and the Falls Curfew was seen as a significant turning point in opinion toward the soldiers. It wasn't long before the soldiers were perceived as actively hostile toward working-class Catholic communities. Recruitment for the provisionals was ramping up, and a power struggle was starting to break out on the Falls Road between the provisionals and the officials. The Falls Road was seen as the epicentre of Irish republicanism. The officials were trying to stamp out the provisionals before they could grow, but it wasn't working. Hughes spoke about the officials, saying that many people were let down by them in 1969 and how they weren't there to protect the community. Many saw them as old men pontificating in pubs and not men of action. In reality, the officials were moving away from violence and more towards Marxist ideology. For many, the provisionals offered the chance to take the fight to the British. They viewed the officials as sellouts for halting attacks, while the officials saw them as reckless sectarians. As a result of the infighting which broke out, Charlie Hughes was killed by the officials in 1971, and feuds between the officials and provisionals would continue throughout the decade. Brendan talked about his cousin's death, saying that as his funeral cortege passed by British soldiers, they saluted, something that is hard to fathom just a few years later. He believed that Charlie's killing was widely condemned. Charlie was a pioneer, he went to Mass, he was a good Catholic. After he died at the hands of the officials, many withdrew their support from them and threw their weight behind the provisionals. (1970 and 71 saw Brendan Hughes on the run frequently, and he described what life was like, saying that there was a number of different call houses in each neighbourhood that he and other provisionals could call into after taking part in an operation. He would be fed, and in some cases the children would be taken out of their beds so that he could get some sleep. Weapons were also hidden this way. Brendan explained that if you were a provisional on the run, you were paid £5 a week. This wasn't much then, and he often had to rely on the public to give him food and cigarettes. He compared it to how the English people must have felt during the Blitz in World War II. A sense of camaraderie was developed. Remember though, this is Brendan's telling of the times. The reality could be different. Did these people support the Provisional IRA out of love, or did some of them do it out of fear? Sometimes the owner of the house was just a volunteer, and sometimes they were sympathetic. They also had a code of sorts. So if an attack was carried out on members of the security services on a nationalist estate, such as the throwing of a blast bomb, if windows were shattered of houses nearby, the IRA would immediately pay for the damage to the homeowners. Hughes quickly rose up the ranks of D Company. He went from volunteer to training officer, and then by 1971 he was promoted to quartermaster. It became his job to source weapons and explosives. and above all else during this period, the Provisionals needed weapons. They were extremely difficult to find. In the early days, the Provisional IRA leadership was based mostly out of Dublin, and the paramilitaries in Belfast felt that the Dubs did not understand the nature of the war that they were waging, which would lead to an internal power struggle later on. Hughes ended up going overseas on the hunt for guns and bombs. In 1971, he headed over to Glasgow, where he met with a contact who was a peterman, which is a term for someone who breaks into safes. The two met in a pub and arranged to travel to a house where weapons would be purchased. Brendan bought a car to transfer the weapons. He and the peterman then met up and drove to the location that he'd been given. As they entered the estate, the peterman shouted, "Get the fuck out of here." They had driven into a loyalist estate, and it would appear that the operation was a setup from the beginning. The pub Brendan and the peterman met in was later bombed, and the op was a complete failure. Through his connections in the Merchant Navy, Brendan had arranged an arms smuggling route on board the ship, the Queen Elizabeth II, which travelled between New York and Southampton. There were IRA sympathisers working on the ship. He set up a small squad of Belfast men in Southampton to get the guns over to Belfast, which would be smuggled in the panels of a car. This whole operation was a little bit unusual in terms of Provisional IRA hierarchy. Usually, it was the higher levels who were tasked with setting up pipelines such as this. The operation in Southampton was in a way a sort of defiance to IRA leadership. Brendan's next mission to acquire weaponry saw him heading over to New York. A seaman on board the Queen Elizabeth II had shown him a booklet about this new gun, the Armalite. After months of using rusty old guns from the 40s and damp ammunition, he decided that this was the gun that the Provisionals needed. The Armalite was the perfect weapon for close-quarter combat, street fighting, which would be how the Provisionals intended on using them. They were compact, easy to fire, and much easier to maintain, compared to other guns which would need to constantly be oiled. Hughes spoke of how frustrating it was with the weapons they currently had. Many ammunition dumps were damp, and the bullets would need to be dried before being used. You would have to fill biscuit tins with damp ammunition and then put them in the oven to dry them out. But if the oven was too hot, they would explode. So it's not exactly an ideal setup. Again, Brendan couldn't understand why leadership in Dublin wasn't doing more to procure weapons, or insisted on using the wrong ones. Either they hadn't really got a clue, or in some sense he felt that they did not want the Belfast Provisionals armed. Did the Dublin leadership not want sophisticated weapons in the hands of Belfast Provisionals? Would this escalate the conflict too quickly? Hughes got a fake passport and travelled over to the US and made contact with members of NORAID there. A meeting was arranged, but the talks broke down. Again, Hughes was told that he was there against the wishes of the IRA leadership, and Chief of Staff Joe Cahill had ordered him to return to Ireland without any weapons. In Hughes' own words, "Well, I'm not fucking going without Armalites." He left the meeting, but at this time in the US, anyone with a driver's licence could buy guns. So Hughes set up a group and they purchased around 26 Armalites and a Winchester rifle to bring home. The guns then made it back to England on the Queen Elizabeth II, and then they were put into the panels of cars and made their way over to Belfast. Hughes remembers that soon after they arrived at Belfast, there was a gun battle on the Falls Road. He drove in and opened the boot of his car and began handing out 16 of the Armalites. And these guns that symbolised much of the entire Troubles had officially entered into the conflict. The problem was that the officials had night scopes and the Provisionals didn't. So once their dump was discovered, the Provisionals robbed the dump and took the sights, which fit onto the Armalites perfectly. Hughes felt that D Company hit their stride as the 70s progressed. His agenda during this period was to, quote, "fight the war, plant as many bombs as I could, to rob as many banks as I could, to kill as many Brits and RUC as I could, to develop the war to a higher level than it was. Escalate, escalate, escalate." By 1973, Hughes had been promoted from quartermaster to OC. He was a wanted man by this stage, but was proving impossible to find. His father convinced him not to get tattoos during his time in the Merchant Navy, as it would have made him too identifiable. His father also got rid of all the photos of him in the family home, meaning that the army didn't even have a photo of the man they were after. They only knew him as Darky, as a result of his tanned complexion. Republicans would take this and start to call him the Dark. Maloney wrote in his book that D Company were extremely effective in waging their war in the Lower Falls. Between 1970 to 1973, only 3 IRA members were killed by the British Army on the Lower Falls, compared with 22 British soldiers dying in bomb and gun attacks. Hughes talked about one incident which saw he and a group of other paramilitaries lobbing nail and blast bombs over a wall into an army base. One nail bomb bounced off the wall and landed beside one of the paramilitaries and detonated. A nail went into his spine. He was scooped up in a van and driven to a call house. There he was placed on a mattress, screaming in agony. Hughes found a doctor and brought him at gunpoint to attend to the man. The doctor told him to put away the gun and that he'd come anyway. It wasn't looking good. The doctor said that if the man was moved, he could die, and that they should call an ambulance. Hughes went and got the man's father and explained the situation. They could bring him to a local hospital where he would be seen, but he was guaranteed to serve 20 years in prison. Or they could risk killing him by moving him and bringing him across the border into Ireland, where he wouldn't face any charges. The man's father left the decision to Brendan, who decided to try and move him. A van and a mattress in the back was procured, and a paramedic had offered to make the journey with the man. Contact was made with South Armagh IRA, who provided a route across the border, and the injured man was brought to Dundalk Hospital. He spent a year in the hospital before being released into the care of his mother, who has looked after him ever since. 1972 was the most lethal year in the history of the Troubles, with 496 people killed that year alone. The IRA was responsible for almost half of that figure. It was a year that the Provisional IRA hit their stride and began to carry out gun attacks and bombings at a ferocious level. This was going on at the same time as secret talks were happening with the British government. Many of these gun and bomb attacks caused devastation amongst the civilian population. In March, we had the Abercorn bombing in Belfast, which claimed the lives of 2 women and injured around 130 others. Many of the injured were women and children who lost limbs and received severe facial injuries. This attack caused much revulsion from the people of Belfast, and it was attacks like this that would bring the reputation of the IRA into question. Then in July of that year we had Bloody Friday, which saw the Provisional IRA detonate at least 20 bombs around Belfast in the space of 80 minutes, most within a half-hour period. 9 people were killed in this attack, most of which were civilians. It was an attack generally considered a disaster for the Provisional IRA. Their intention was to wreck the infrastructure around Belfast, but in reality, images were broadcast around the world of victims' remains being shovelled up off the street and into bags. It was horrific. Brendan Hughes was one of the key figures involved in Bloody Friday. He said of the attacks, quote, "I was the operational commander of the Bloody Friday operation. I remember when the bombs started to go off. I was in Leeson Street and I thought, there's too much here. I sort of knew that there were going to be casualties. I feel a bit guilty about it because, as I say, there was no intention to kill anyone that day. I have a fair deal of regret that Bloody Friday took place. A great deal of regret. If I could do it over again, I wouldn't do it." 1972 also saw the beginning of the Provisional IRA's disappearing of people. I've written about the disappearance of Joe Linsky many times, but most of that information came from Hughes's admissions during the Boston College interviews. He explained what happened in the lead up to Joe being taken. Joe had an affair with an IRA member's wife and then had ordered the killing of her husband. The operation went awry and Linsky was picked up and never seen alive again. Hughes explained that there was a secret group called the Unknowns, whose job was to handle situations like this, to drive people like Joe across the border where he would be killed and secretly buried. Hughes doesn't name Dolores Price, but before she died, she was interviewed for the Boston College tapes and admitted that she was a member of the group. 2 other men who disappeared were Seamus Wright and Kevin McKee. Wright was a member of D Company and had suspiciously gone missing. And then when Hughes looked into it, he found out that Wright had turned informer, and also mentioned that Kevin McKee had too. I've talked about both these men in previous episodes this season, but essentially, when discovered to be informers, both men thought that they were safe from getting killed by the IRA. They admitted that they had been recruited by the secretive group, the Military Reaction Force, which was an intelligence gathering unit of the British Army, and their intel led to the uncovering of a covert army intelligence gathering operation around Belfast. Both Wright and McKee were brought across the border and kept in a safe house for a number of weeks. Then the order was passed down for them to be killed. Hughes was quite upset by this. He felt betrayed by the IRA leadership. He had told the men that they would be safe and believed that there was no purpose in their killing. And it was simply the provisional leadership enacting revenge on the men. You can't really talk about the disappeared without talking about the most controversial one, which was the disappearance of Jean McConville. In Voices from the Grave, Brendan explained that McConville, who was living in Divis Flats, was found with the transmitter in her apartment, and it appeared that she was communicating with the British Army and giving them information. He himself had removed the device from her apartment and issued her with a warning. Just to mention, the account of this transmitter existing has never been proven and has strongly been disputed. McConville was then picked up and interrogated and released a few weeks later, but another transmitter was found in her home. For this, she had to die. He knew she was to be killed this time, but said he didn't know much else about it. He also believed that it was the correct action to be taken when somebody was found to be informing. He just didn't see the point or purpose in the hiding of her body. Hughes' statements in the Boston College tapes regarding who ordered the killing of Jean McConville would have significant repercussions in the real world after they were released, but I'll get to that later. In March 1973, the Provisional IRA took their bombing campaign overseas to London. Hughes stressed that the initiative for this operation came from the Belfast Brigade of the IRA. They were the ones who planned, organised and recruited paramilitaries who would take part in the initial attack. This attack, which became known as the Old Bailey bombing, saw the team target 4 places in London with car bombs. Hughes wrote that the intention was not to kill anyone, but rather strike at the heart of the British establishment. One person was killed after suffering a heart attack as a result of the bombing. Lessons were learned after this attack. Next time, the team would be embedded in England and not try and flee straight away. So by 1973, Brendan Hughes had established himself as one of the key figures in the Provisional IRA. He and others in Belfast and Derry were tired of taking orders from the likes of Rory O'Brady in Dublin, feeling he was disconnected from the war that they were waging. This would eventually see the establishment of Northern Command in 1976, but for now, Hughes and others in Belfast were operating semi-independently. But Hughes' time on the run was coming to an end. He had been nearly arrested and killed numerous times, but July 19th, 1973 would be a disastrous day for the Provisional IRA in Belfast. Every day, brigade staff would meet to plan operations and robberies and come together to see what was possible. On this day, most had left, leaving Hughes sitting in a house where the meeting was taking place. With him was Gerry Adams and Tom Cahill. Gerry Adams and Brendan Hughes had a long and very close friendship throughout this time, and had an immense amount of trust in each other. Brendan looked outside the window and saw a suspicious car outside. He grabbed a provisional and told him to go get a squad together and pull the car in. The men approached the car but were threatened with a machine gun before the car sped off. He must have radioed whoever he was working with though, because within seconds, the house was surrounded. Hughes was brought to Springfield Road Police Station and claimed that he was tortured there.
We were all taken to Springfield Road RUC station, where we were interrogated by plainclothes British troops, British undercover operatives, and we were tortured. I was continually tortured for a period of up to 8 hours. I was beaten with small hammers. I was tied against the wall and continually punched and kicked. I was then tied to a chair and continually beaten. They put a weapon, a gun, 45, in my mouth and pulled the trigger. Obviously, it didn't work. They threatened to shoot me there and dump me on the Black Mountain and put a statement out saying the loyalists had killed me.
This was considered a significant catch for the British Army. They handcuffed him to another soldier and took his photo, and then he was loaded into an army helicopter and brought to Long Kesh prison. Hughes remembers the cheering from prisoners as he was brought into the prison. But he only had one thing on his mind: escape. Long Kesh would later go on to be known as the Maze Prison, though many nationalists refused to use that name. It was opened in 1971 with the launch of internment in Northern Ireland, which saw many people arrested and held with little to no evidence proving that they were paramilitaries. It was composed of 22 Nissen huts, or cages, each which could house up to 120 men. It was overcrowded, damp, cold and rat-infested, and was around 20 minutes south of Belfast, beside the town of Lisburn, which is a majority Protestant town. This meant that if you staged an escape, you couldn't knock on the door of any resident who would be sympathetic toward you. An escape had to be well thought out. After spending a few months in the prison, Hughes identified a weak link that could potentially facilitate an escape: the bin lorry. The lorry passed through the camp twice a day picking up rubbish. And initially a plan was concocted that involved the attaching of a harness to the bottom of the lorry and essentially hanging on from underneath. But Hughes practiced this with his bunk bed and found it was far too difficult. He was too weak from the beating he had received from the army. Another prisoner went in his place, but when the lorry hit a speed bump on the way out, he was crushed and his back was broken. But what if Hughes was sewn into a mattress that was thrown out? That could potentially work, especially as they had an inside man, a guy working for the bin company who drove the lorry. So that's what happened. Hughes was sewn into the mattress, which was left outside the hut. The lorry came along and he was thrown into the back. The army used to spear mattresses to make sure nobody was hiding inside them, but Hughes had been told that this practice had been stopped. Over the next couple of hours, there were more and more loads of rubbish put on top of Hughes in the mattress. Eventually, the lorry began to leave the compound, but was stopped at the exit. And that's when the spears came through the mattress. Unbeknownst to Hughes, the practice had been resumed. One spear went through the mattress to the left of him, and one to the right. By sheer luck, they had both missed him. The lorry then drove out of the compound, and Hughes was free. Well, nearly. He had to then cut himself out of the mattress and jump out of the lorry. He had a little bit of money and set about finding a car to steal. He also wasn't aware that somebody had seen him jump from the lorry and had reported it, so time wasn't exactly on his side. He was also in Hillsborough, which was a predominantly loyalist area, so he needed to be smart. He began hitchhiking and was first picked up by some Irish travellers, and then he was picked up by an Englishman who had a child asleep in the back seat of his car. Hughes sat in the front and was convinced that the Englishman was a prison guard, and Hughes told him that he was working at a local sawmill and was going home due to an injury in his eye. He got as far as Newry, but he was aware that the head count back in prison was taking place quite soon, so he didn't have much time before the alarm was raised. He flagged down a taxi and asked the man to take him to Dundalk, across the border in the Republic of Ireland. But it wasn't long before they hit an army checkpoint. The taxi driver gave his ID, and then soldiers came around to Brendan and asked to see his. He pulled out a receipt from a leather shop and showed it to the army, saying that's where he worked. Somehow they didn't question this and waved him on. And then within a few minutes they were across the border into the Republic of Ireland. In his excitement to be free of the army pursuing him, Hughes asked the taxi driver for a cigarette and told him that he had just escaped from Long Kesh. The taxi driver thumped him on the back with excitement. But it was short-lived, as the two suddenly came upon an Irish Gardaí checkpoint. And now instead of just Hughes being terrified, the two of them were. Luckily, they were waved through, and the taxi driver brought him to a pub where he knew he would be safe. And that was it. Brendan Hughes had successfully escaped from Long Kesh and made it across the border. He had arrived to a well-known Republican pub, and the men were shocked to see him. He was brought a double whiskey, and the chef put on steak to celebrate. Coincidentally, a busload of Irish Republicans from Portadown were coming to the pub for a trad session. Hughes asked the owner not to mention that he was there, but once everyone got drunk, the owner got up on stage and announced Hughes' presence to a cheering crowd. The next morning, Hughes knew he had to get out of town, as too many people knew where he was. IRA quartermaster Brian Keenan picked him up and brought him down to Dublin, where he dyed his hair and disappeared. This escape happened on December 8th, and Hughes was back in Belfast operating by Christmas. Then in 1974, Ivor Bell was arrested, and Hughes assumed command of the Belfast Brigade of the IRA. He couldn't keep operating on the run like he had been doing in previous years. Everyone who saw him instantly recognised him as Darky Hughes, and the army was well aware of what he looked like by now. So to combat this, he developed a new identity. A property was bought in Myrtlefield Park in Belfast that would serve as his base of operations. He became Arthur McAllister, a travelling toy salesman. He dressed in a suit and carried a briefcase. It was during this period he started to become mistrustful of the Provisional IRA, feeling that those above him were secretly making deals with the British. In 1974 and 1975, IRA leadership was indeed having back-channel talks with the British government, and there was a point that they believed that a political and physical withdrawal of the army was on the horizon, but this amounted to very little in the end. And instead of peace being on the horizon, the violence just seemed to escalate. Long Kesh changed and became known as the Maze, and the new H-blocks were introduced. The RUC seemed to take a back seat, and the army became the main force to confront the IRA. Loyalists also ramped up their attacks, some of which were no-warning bombs thrown into pubs and were seen as sectarian. These were met with an increasing amount of sectarian attacks from some provisional brigades. This angered Hughes, who felt that the attacks like this damaged the IRA's image. Hughes' time in the run was short-lived, and he was caught on May the 10th, 1974. An informer named Eamon Malloy told his handlers about Hughes' whereabouts, and he was caught in his house on Myrtlefield Park. A cache of weapons and stolen money was also found in the house. For this, Brendan Hughes was sentenced to 15 years. Eamon Malloy would later be disappeared by the IRA. This time, Hughes was brought to Crumlin Road Prison, where he claimed political status. He was housed with around 250 other Republican prisoners, where he was soon made OC of the prisoners in the jail. His role was to interview new IRA members who came in and see if they had broken under interrogation or had turned informer. Anyone discovered to be informing by the IRA would often receive a bullet once they were released from prison. This was a very confusing time for Brendan. They had no idea who they could trust, as they uncovered more and more paramilitaries who had turned informer. At one stage, he believed that there was an army threat to poison all their food. There was a huge protest in Long Kesh on October 15th, 1974, where Republican inmates set fire to 21 compounds in protest against beatings and poor conditions. To show solidarity with them, Hughes organised rioting in Crumlin, where the inmates rioted and wrecked the jail. Shortly after this, Hughes was sent to Long Kesh to finish out his sentence, where he was reunited with Gerry Adams and Ivor Bell. David Morley was the highest-ranking paramilitary when Hughes arrived, and the two didn't get along. Morley was an ex-soldier and had the prisoners marching and carrying out drills, and Hughes thought that he was an idiot, and that Morley felt that his presence in the prison was a threat to his leadership. Morley was also one of the only ones who had a direct communication to the leadership outside the prison. Hughes felt that the strings of the Republican movement were being controlled by the British around this time. This sounds wild, but this was around a time where prisoners who had been interned were slowly being released in drips. Hughes believed that they were releasing paramilitaries who they believed they could deal with, who would have been more conservative than others. The ones that were deemed too dangerous would not be released. In this way, they were controlling the narrative and shaping the Provisional IRA, and many provisionals in Crumlin Road were going along with it. This is again how Hughes felt. Morley was telling them that the war was nearly over, and if they behaved, they would be released in no time. But Hughes felt that things were only ramping up, and the promise of peace was simply untrue. He felt that the British were trying to get them involved in a long, drawn-out ceasefire, and were not promising anything in return. Hughes was extremely critical of this, and of Morley's leadership, and was eventually threatened by the IRA with being court-martialed for dissent. He grew so disillusioned that he decided to join the INLA, who had a presence in the prison, but he was persuaded against this by Adams, who said that the only way to defeat these people was from within. By 1975, this division had deepened. Adams, Hughes and Ivor didn't respect Morley's leadership and the decisions being made by the Army Council on the outside. Hughes saw a change in Adams, who began to talk of a political solution and wanting to have a politically educated rank and file. Many prisoners started taking part in lectures and debates, and Hughes wanted these young paramilitaries to think for themselves. Then in 1976 we saw the end of special category status, which meant that the idea of a political prisoner was gone, and that all prisoners were just that. This would lead to 5 years of protesting by Republican prisoners, which would culminate in the 1981 hunger strikes. 1976 was also the same year we saw the establishment of Northern Command and Southern Command within the IRA. Northern Command focused on the 6 counties in Northern Ireland and handled frontline ops, with Southern Command shifting to logistics. The Provisional IRA itself also began a significant reorganisation around 1977 into smaller cell structures, which would make it more difficult for British intelligence to penetrate. As a result of this, many of the conversations that were taking place in the prison in 1976 were talking about this new cell structure, and also having basic weapons and explosives training. Morley and Adams were both scheduled to be released in 1977, which would see a shake-up in the prison. And by the end of the year, Brendan Hughes, at 29, was elected commander of the Special Category Prisoners in the Maze. There was still a lot of tension between IRA prisoners in the prison, and Hughes went around trying to defuse this. The last thing he wanted was a split amongst the prisoners. This wasn't easy, and many prisoners, such as Bobby Sands, were loyal to the old leadership. Hughes believed that the previous one led without any input from its members, but he wanted them to speak up. But there was a problem. After a bout of rioting that Hughes tried to defuse, he ended up caught in it and was punished by the prison, and was given an additional 5 years, where he was sent to the newly built H blocks. He'd been previously staying in the cages, which were where special category status or political prisoners were housed. The H blocks were designed to house paramilitary prisoners, but this was Thatcher's time, and she was determined to end special category status and show the world that these IRA prisoners were what she perceived as murderers and terrorists, and not political prisoners at all. So any existing special category status prisoners would keep that status until 1980, but any new paramilitaries coming into the H blocks were to be treated as regular inmates. Hughes arrived at the H blocks in 1978, and by then the protesting was well underway. Hughes arrived at the H blocks in 1978, and by this stage the prisoners were refusing to wear their prison-issued uniforms, choosing to be on the blanket instead. This then escalated into the dirty protests, which saw them smearing their feces on the wall of their cells. It wasn't long before Hughes was elected OC of the prisoners in the H blocks, but it did take him some time to find his footing there. He initially suggested that the prisoners, who had been on the blanket for 2 years by now, put on their uniform and destroy the prison from within. But they refused. After 2 years, they were entrenched in their protest, one which Hughes initially didn't see much worth in. By now, the men in the H blocks had most of their privileges revoked and were living in quite terrible conditions. And there simply wasn't much outrage on the outside, as the men were not allowed to have visitation unless they wore the prison uniforms. Hughes understood that the protests needed to be coordinated and escalated, and the world needed to see how the prisoners were being treated. So some prisoners were asked if they would wear the uniform just to have visitation, where their writings could be smuggled out of the prison. By this stage, Bobby Sands had been released and then rearrested and now found himself in the H blocks. He was an incredibly prolific writer and was selected to be a PRO of sorts. He began to write many notes which were secretly smuggled out of the prison. These were known as comms and were incredibly small, written on cigarette papers and smuggled out of the prison either rectally or up a prisoner's mouth. The guards soon grew aware of this, and prisoners were soon subjected to quite aggressive rectal exams before having their visitation. Hughes was happy to be one of the leaders of the protest, as he believed that this advanced the cause of the Provisional IRA on the outside. But again, it was messy, especially when you asked who was actually making the decisions. Should the protesting prisoners decide what they were doing, or should that decision be left to the IRA on the outside? In the early days of the strikes, the decision to escalate was firmly in the hands of the prisoners. That being said, there was input from the outside. The 5 demands, for example, came from the outside, which were 1. The right not to wear a prison uniform, 2. The right not to do prison work, 3. The right of free association, 4. The right to educational and recreational facilities, and 5. Full restoration of remission. The no-wash protests began in 1978, which then escalated into the dirty protests. Hughes was quite intimidated once the dirty protests began, describing it as the feeling of being on a bicycle at the top of a hill and speeding downhill. He had no idea where this would end. Their cells had been destroyed and they were covered in feces, and the brutality of the prison guards had gotten much worse. In previous times, Hughes often had relationships with prison officers to allow for negotiations. But this had ended. Conditions gradually grew worse and worse. Here's Brendan.
Through the protests we were making, we eventually destroyed our beds, smashed them up, broke the windows. So we were left with a mattress. All we had was a blanket and a mattress on the floor. And they would come in, most nights they would come in with hose pipes and just open the cell door and you get hosed down. Other times they would come in with very, very strong disinfectant and just throw a bucket of disinfectant around you to the point where it brought tears to the eyes. It was very, very painful. After we smashed the windows, they came in and put iron grills on the windows. So we were totally sealed in. This carried on for almost 3 years. I mean, you would wake up in the morning with snow on you. The windows were totally open until they put the grills on. Even with the grills on, very often they turned the heat off at nights. In the cold winter nights, they turned the heat off. In the hot summer days, they turned the heat on. They would put a large machine. We used to pour the urine out the cell doors at nights. And they would put this large sucker machine in to lift and leave the machine all night. It was like a generator going all night. They left the lights on all night. And as I say, in the winter nights, they would turn the heat off.
Eventually, the prison authorities made a decision to forcefully wash and shave the protesters. Hughes felt that this was a threat to the success of the protests. Bobby Sands was in the cell beside him, and the two talked long into the night about what to do. Eventually, it was decided that the protesters would be ordered to violently resist these forced washings. To ask a naked man to fight tooth and nail against multiple prison officers in full protective gear with batons and helmets was a big ask. The following morning, as the guards came in to wash the men, they were attacked. 2 prisoners were sent to the hospital, but the plan worked and the forced washings were called off. Again, it's hard to fully get into words how hated some of these prison guards, or screws as they were called by Republicans, were. Some of their names were sent out of the prisons to the IRA on the outside, who began executing them. Between 1978 and 1980, 13 prison guards were killed by the Provisional IRA outside of the prison. They would target ones in positions of power, or ones that were considered especially violent towards prisoners. So by 1979, conditions were worsening in the prison. With the killings of prison officers on the outside, prisoner beatings were getting more severe, and there were attempts to break up the leadership by moving some of the prisoners around. The IRA men were demoralised and needed to see a light at the end of the tunnel. Brendan Hughes and Bobby Sands realised that they needed to escalate things further, and in September they sent word out that they would be staging a hunger strike. A significant Republican leader on the outside replied to him saying that this was suicidal and that Thatcher would let the prisoners die. A hunger strike really was the last solution for these protesters. It was succeed or die. Just to clarify, they were not ordered not to do it by the IRA leadership. but rather strongly advised against it. Cardinal Tommaso Fee, the Catholic Primate of All Ireland, was campaigning on behalf of the prisoners and attempted to mediate between the British government and Republican prisoners. And for a moment, Hughes and his men thought that this was going somewhere, and that they wouldn't have to go on strike. But when he realised Thatcher wasn't backing down, the strike was inevitable. Hughes described a visit in the prison with Danny Morrison, who told him that the door had been firmly closed. He left and walked back to his men in the cells. He described it as, quote, the loneliest walk back from the visits that I ever had.
And I was told this on a visit. I got a visit from Danny Morrison, and Danny told me. He brought a cigar up for me that day, and I lit the cigar up, and the only time you could smoke was on the visit. And I smoked the cigar, and he told me that the door was closed, the Cardinal got nothing, and I didn't know what to do. And he asked me, actually, what are you going to do now? And I said, there's no alternative, but hunger strike, we have to. We've nothing left except hunger strike. And I walked back, and it was a long walk from the visits back to the His Black. And I remember, I'll never forget the walk back. The prison officer beside me, walking back with a long beard, long hair, dirty, filthy, and walking up the path. And walking up the path into the blocks, there's two wings, and every face was at the window looking to see if I had any scale, as we call scale, which is news, had any news for them. And I didn't know what I was going to tell these people.
The men back at the cells were practically expecting him to be carrying brown bags full of civilian clothing, but instead he was telling them that the talks had collapsed and that they were going on hunger strike. But first he got back to his cell and told Bobby Sands. The two communicated through a small hole in a heating pipe near the floor, and later that night he told the rest of the prisoners, and there was total silence in the wing. For this first hunger strike, anybody could volunteer, and of the 300 Republican prisoners in the prison, around 90 people submitted their names. He and Bobby worked their way through the list, eliminating anybody with health issues or that they believed were too weak. They then had to choose how many prisoners would strike. Hughes chose one INLA man, John Nixon, and then 6 others, one from each county in Northern Ireland. So the first hunger strike began on October 27, 1980, which saw John Nixon, Tommy McKierney, Leo Green, Tom McFeely, Sean McKenna, Raymond McCarthy and Brendan Hughes refuse their breakfast. In the Armagh Women's Prison, 3 inmates also went on strike: Mairead Farrell, Mary Doyle and Mairead Nugent. This first hunger strike would last for 53 days, before coming to a bitter and disappointing end. During that time, Hughes had been replaced as OC by Bobby Sands, as he couldn't do his duties while on the strike. Hughes remembers his time on hunger strike, when all he could ingest was salt and water. Quote, "The memory of the salt water and the sickness and the smell of watching your flesh. I mean, the body is a fantastic machine. It'll eat off all the fat tissue first, and then it starts eating away at the muscle to keep your brain alive. When that goes, all that's left is your brain, and it starts to go as well. And that's when the brain damage sets in. Your body needs glucose, and the last supply of glucose is in your brain." Hughes thought that Sean McKenna was one of the weakest men, mentally and physically, on the strike, and would need to be watched carefully. He actually initially rejected him, but McKenna pleaded with him to join. Hughes eventually let him join, but made a promise to him that he would not let him die. And after 53 days, McKenna slipped into a coma, and Hughes was told by doctors that he only had hours to live. Hughes was somewhat sceptical, and was suspicious that there was a bug in his cell, and the guards knew that he had promised to take McKenna off the strike if he came close to death. Either way, he wasn't going to take that risk and asked doctors to intervene and feed him, thus ending the strike for the rest of the men. It was December 18th, 1980. He was also of the belief that a document was on its way from the British government, conceding to their demands. But this would soon turn out to be completely false. The strike had accomplished absolutely nothing. Outside of the prison, Sinn Féin treated the end of the strike as a victory, but Hughes was embarrassed. there was no victory here. He would go on to feel this way again in the wake of the celebrations following the Good Friday Agreement. After 53 days on strike, he was severely weakened, demoralised and depressed. He questioned if he should have let McKenna die. He met McKenna later on in life, who had suffered brain damage and permanent damage to his eyesight after the strike. McKenna said to him, quote, "Fuck you, Dark. You should have let me die." This depression that Brendan Hughes sunk into in the wake of the first hunger strike took years to leave him. In the wake of the failure of the first strike, the British government appeared somewhat victorious by not giving in to the prisoners' demands. But this failure only strengthened the resolve of the strikers, and on March the 1st, 1981, the second hunger strike began, and Bobby Sands became the first person to refuse food. This time it would be staggered. Each striker would go on strike a couple of weeks apart, and they would all reach the critical point at different intervals. As Sands was first, he was almost certain that he would die, and this is one of the reasons that Bobby Sands has become such an important figure amongst nationalists. Once Sands passed away, then there was mounting pressure on the next striker to continue with their strike, and it sort of cascaded until 10 people had died. This was broadcast all over the world, and was one of the most significant moments of the Troubles. For Brendan Hughes, this was all a haze, as he'd been so weakened by his hunger strike. He was very against the second strike taking place, though. After the first strike ended, he and Bobby had meetings, and he tried to prevent him from calling another strike, but to no avail. Then, after Bobby died, Brendan tried to convince the OC, Bick McFarlane, to call it off and prevent more deaths. But the strikers continued to die. In Brendan's own words, "I was a passenger on this moving train that was slowly killing people. The feeling of utter futility I had after Bobby died." Brendan believed that the IRA leadership on the outside could have done more to prevent more strikers from dying, and that Bick, as leader on the inside, was restricted by them. He expressed his guilt and shame talking with Francis Hughes, who was the second striker to die after Sands. "I remember feeling really, really guilty. Talking to Francis Hughes before he went on hunger strike. Francis came over and gave me a hug and told me that I shouldn't feel bad about it, the way the first strike had ended. And I felt, what can I say here? And I didn't say anything to him. You don't say to a person who's about to embark on a hunger strike, 'I think you're wrong.' I sometimes regret my not saying that, even though I said it to Bick. But you don't say it to a man who is walking to his death. And beside that, I was disillusioned and embarrassed. Here I was alive, and here was another man, walking onto the treadmill I had just left. I felt like an outsider among them. I found it very, very hard to live with myself, because I felt that possibly I should have been dead, rather than the other 10 men." During his interview for the Boston College tapes, Brendan was asked if he felt that the leadership was doing enough to prevent the deaths of the strikers. He felt that there was an unnecessary amount of pressure put on the families of the strikers. Shortly before they died, they would fall into a coma, and the family members could intervene and save their loved one's life, but in many cases they were told not to by the striker. Brendan felt that this was somewhat cowardly, as the provisional movement were putting pressure on the families to keep their loved ones on the hunger strike. He believed that if the leadership ordered the end of the strike, the prisoners would have ended it, and to him, the 5 demands were not that important. They could have survived without them. In his own words, the prisoners deserved more after suffering through 5 years of protesting, and quote, "The 5 demands wasn't worth one death." He believed that the leadership did not call off the strike because the protests outside the prison were large, and the political party Sinn Féin could continue to grow in size and influence. When Stormont held elections in 1982, Sinn Féin surprised everybody by securing 10% of the seats, and around 40% of the nationalist vote. This really did show how successful the political movement could be. In the wake of the strikes, Brendan still had a sentence to finish. The 5 demands had been more or less met, and the leadership in the prison had shifted to men who were loyal to Martin McGuinness on the outside. and Hughes and these men didn't exactly see eye to eye. The prison was also intending to desegregate the Loyalist and Republican prisoners, something which the Republicans were dead set against. The leadership concocted a plan to single out elderly Protestant prisoners and give them a beating to try and force the prison's hand. The inmate selected was Maxcy Maxwell, who had helped Hughes during the blanket protest. He was a Protestant, not a Loyalist, and Hughes threatened to intervene physically if any IRA man tried to attack Maxcy. Integration didn't last long and was eventually called off, but not before Hughes struck up an unlikely friendship with one of the Shankill butchers, Basher Bates. The Shankill butchers were a sectarian Loyalist gang who would abduct and kill Catholic men on their way home from the pub. They are one of the most well-known and infamous groups to emerge during the Troubles and were known for the sheer violence in their attacks. Hughes was curious to know what would cause someone to act in such a violent way. The two struck up a conversation as Basher was having difficulty with his wife. Hughes's wife had left him while he was in prison, and the two got talking. Hughes was, quote, trying to find out where the hatred was coming from and how they could cut people up, how they could butcher people. And he told me that he was not by nature a bigot. He was not by nature a butcher. He was not by nature someone who hated people. I asked specifically the question, how the hell can you cut people up and how the hell can you take some innocent Catholic off the street and kill him? And he answered, drink, drugs and company. In Hughes's eyes, Basher is someone who had hate preached at him his entire life and then fell into the circumstances which allowed him to become a butcher. In a bizarre turn of events, other Loyalists in the prison had concocted a plan to kill Hughes. They were going to place a homemade bomb under the bed in his cell. On the day it was due to happen, Basher Bates stood up and loudly announced to other Loyalists that if anybody attempted to kill Hughes, they would have to kill him first. Bates would go on to be killed shortly after being released by a UDA man whose father had been killed by Bates. Brendan Hughes was released from prison in 1986 after serving 13 years. He was released into a world that was very different to the one he left back in 1973. Sinn Féin was now a viable vehicle for change, and Hughes believed that they wanted to do as much as possible to curtail the violence of the Provisional IRA, which could lose them voters. Not all those in Sinn Féin were happy to transition to politics though, and the British Army was having trouble taking on the Provisionals during this period. This was around the time that they were receiving significant arms shipments from Libya, so they were incredibly well armed. Upon his release, Hughes had nowhere to live. His marriage had fallen apart and there was no home to go to, so he ended up moving in with Gerry Adams and his wife Colette. Amongst Republicans, Adams was now perceived to be devoted to the political side of things, but Hughes saw himself as a soldier, not a politician, and he rejoined with the Provisional IRA. He ended up as Director of Operations and Assistant Director of Intelligence. Generally, this meant that he was in charge of operations outside of Northern Command's remit, which would focus on England, and also finding out informers in their ranks. Meanwhile, within the Provisional IRA, there was also mistrust between those who wanted to maintain the violence and those who wanted to have both, supporting the IRA and also supporting Sinn Féin. Hughes believed that the Provisional IRA was in a very poor state. The brigades operating in England were burnt out, and other brigades around Ireland were demoralised. Hughes believed that this may have been allowed to happen to pave the way for the political process. 1987 saw Brendan Hughes given a seat on the Army Council of the Provisional IRA, but by this stage his relationship with them was drastically deteriorating. He was asked to go to the USA and hook in with NORAID to secure funding, as his status as Darky Hughes the Blanket Man was well known amongst nationalists in the US. While there, he was adamant to those who gave him money that this was not going to Sinn Féin. This money was going towards buying weapons, buying explosives, and continuing with the war. As much as Hughes mistrusted Sinn Féin, it would appear that throughout the 80s he worked with them, and even claimed that he worked to fabricate votes for them. Quote, I had loads of dead people. I had babies' names, I had babies who weren't born, I had babies who were in the graveyard, they all voted, and that's how we got into the position we are now. One of Brendan's tasks while in the IRA was not just to hunt down informers, but also root out torturers in the security department. There were 2 Provisional IRA members who were given the nickname Burke and Hare as a result of their violent methods which were used when interrogating Provisional IRA members. A friend of Hughes experienced one of these interrogations where he was burned by cigarettes, starved for a number of days, and even waterboarded. The men were dismissed from the IRA, but eventually returned at a lower level. But Hughes's return to the Provisional IRA would only end in disillusionment. He began to believe that the IRA was completely riddled with informers, all the way up to the highest level. There was a man called Joe Fenton, who was not in the IRA but was well known in provisional circles. He was an estate agent and had a reputation for being able to help paramilitaries, getting them cars to smuggle weapons across the border, safe houses to have meetings or store weapons, and he even organised illegal mortgages for paramilitaries who had no incomes. When Brendan got out of prison, Fenton organised a house for him to live in. He found this extremely suspicious, that he could be given a house just like that. It eventually emerged that Fenton was an RUC agent, and the houses that he was providing were bugged by RUC Special Branch. When it emerged that Fenton was an informer, Hughes intended on interrogating him. But instead, Fenton was immediately killed by provisionals. This made Hughes suspicious, believing that Fenton was killed quickly to protect somebody bigger in the IRA, and that he had been thrown to the wolves by RUC Special Branch for this reason. His faith and trust in the Provisional IRA movement, which had taken up most of his life, was shattered, and he felt that the entire movement had gone corrupt, believing that he could be killed at any moment. So he decided to leave Belfast and headed down to Dublin to work with the IRA's GHQ there. By the time he eventually returned to Belfast, he was finished with the Provisional IRA. He got a job in a bar, and though he was approached by IRA members asking him to rejoin, he refused. Brendan believed that the Provisional IRA wanted to maintain an image, that it was a movement and that all of his members had an equal say. But by the end, he felt that the leadership was absolute, and anyone who challenged their rule was expendable. Anyone who questioned them would be, quote, ridiculed, degraded, shot, or put out of the game altogether. Hughes and Gerry Adams had a very special friendship in the early days of the Troubles. But this relationship in later years completely soured and eventually collapsed. In Brendan's own words, "I would have died for him. I would have jumped in front of him to save him from being shot and taken the bullet myself. I would have done that because I really believed what he was saying in his writings, in his talks. I believed him and I feel betrayed by him. I feel really betrayed. I feel it personally." I'm doing my best to explain exactly how Hughes grew so disillusioned, but it's not easy. He felt that the IRA and Sinn Féin basically became the new SDLP. Where they originally stood for the betterment of the working class people, this has changed and been replaced by middle class career politicians. And he felt that they turned a revolutionary movement into a conservative organisation. Hughes's bitter departure from the Provisional IRA remained with him, and the Good Friday Agreement fed this. He felt this was the IRA giving up. What had his friends died for? What had people been killed for? For things to stay exactly as they were? It was this bitterness that led him to giving an interview for the Boston College tapes, and really talking to anyone who would listen. The Boston College tapes were a project aimed at trying to preserve the history of the Troubles by interviewing those who took part in it. The interviews then wouldn't be released until the interviewee died, so that they couldn't be arrested for anything incriminating that they said. Hughes conducted an incredibly detailed interview, where he was extremely candid about his time in the IRA. Most ex-paramilitaries do not talk at all, and for someone at the level of the organisation that Hughes was at, this was extremely significant. In his own words, "I think it's important for future generations to know that I was a member of the IRA, a high-ranking member of the IRA, and here I am, 53 years old, for the first time in my life admitting it publicly. History is written by the victors. In this particular case, the defeated have a chance to put on the record their role and their perspective in this so-called victory. I'll come back to these tapes shortly. Brendan Hughes' final years were lonely. He was more or less shunned by the Republican movement and lost a lot of friends over his criticism of the Good Friday Agreement and the direction of Sinn Féin. He worked construction jobs in the 90s and then as a barman, and then he was unemployed for a number of years. His relationship with his girlfriend had also ended, so he was then unemployed and depressed, living in a council flat on the top floor of the last remaining block of Divis Flats, called Divis Tower, looking out over the Falls Road. Directly above him was a British Army observation post. He also had a lot of health issues. Perhaps this was from his days on hunger strike, wrecking his body, or the fact he was clinically depressed with the drinking problem. He had a heart attack, followed by bypass surgery. Then in February 2008, he developed a chest infection, which turned into influenza. He refused to go to the hospital, and his sister ended up calling a doctor to the apartment, who ordered him admitted to a hospital. He was admitted, and then a week later, on Saturday, February 16th, Brendan Hughes died. He was given a full Republican funeral. Thousands of people turned up to pay their respects. His coffin was draped with the Irish tricolour, as well as a black beret and gloves, which were a symbol of his paramilitary days. His funeral cortege passed through the Falls Road, where he used to operate as a young man. In the days before his death, Gerry Adams, who was the leader of Sinn Féin, visited his old friend's bedside in the hospital, and even carried his coffin into the church. Adams also released a statement celebrating and praising Hughes. It would appear that the rift between the Republican movement and Brendan Hughes had been repaired, and in death, Hughes was back in the fold. Well, that's one reading of it. The reality is a little bit different. Maloney wrote in Voices from the Grave that in the months before Brendan died, he reached out to the leader of the D Company Veterans Group and provided him with explicit instructions on what should happen if he died. He did not want Gerry Adams, Sinn Féin, or any Provisional IRA members to have anything to do with his funeral. He was worried that they would use his funeral as a propaganda campaign to say that he and Adams had reconciled. Gerry Adams wanted to speak at his funeral, but was blocked because of Hughes' instructions. They did allow him to carry the coffin briefly, and a photo was taken which appeared in the papers. The original telling also seemed to suggest that Adams visited Hughes in the hospital, and while on his deathbed the two reconciled. In reality, Hughes was unconscious both times Adams visited. Brendan Hughes was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in 3 places: the grave of his parents, the ruins of his grandparents' home in County Louth, and the D Company Memorial on the Falls Road in Belfast. With Hughes dead, that meant that his recording from the Boston College tapes could be published. This was in the form of the book Voices from the Grave by Ed Maloney, who was the journalist who carried out these interviews. This is the main source for this episode. The whole thing was to go on to become a complete disaster. In his released interview, Hughes implicated a number of living people, specifically Gerry Adams, saying that he was tied to the IRA and specifically to the abduction and killing of Jean McConville. As a result of this, the PSNI demanded to see more of the tapes and issued a subpoena to Boston College, who handed over 11 of the interviews, and the entire tapes project was then scrapped. This then led to the 2014 arrest of Gerry Adams. He voluntarily presented himself for questioning, strenuously denied any involvement in the murder or membership in the IRA, and was released without charge. Gerry Adams has consistently denied ever being a member of the IRA or participating in IRA operations. We've come to the end of the story of Brendan Hughes. His life story really does encompass that of the entire Troubles, and was important for me to do it justice and do it in its entirety, so apologies that it's taken me a while to release this episode. Hughes remains one of the most beloved individuals in the Republican movement, and in the end, he went to his grave feeling abandoned by the very history that he helped to shape. And it was his interview for the Boston College project which pulled back the curtain and showed us exactly what his life was like. Former IRA volunteer, writer and historian Anthony McIntyre wrote about Hughes' death. And it's with this I'll finish the episode. He died believing that Sinn Féin, under the leadership of Gerry Adams, had deserted the poor had ignored the terrible effects of long-term imprisonment on many IRA volunteers and had made its peace with Britain on British terms. He also believed that Irish unity was no closer to being achieved than it was at the beginning of the Provisional IRA's campaign. One of his most frequent questions was, what was it all for? Thanks, and see you next time.